let me just make maybe two quick points, and hopefully there'll be ones that we can explore a little further in our conversation. Is first, there is something necessarily, arbitrary about 20 years, but at the same time, Renata, as you suggested, it is a good moment for reflection. And I think as an American, one can't get away from the reality that 9/11 upended American foreign policy in a really fundamental way. It's really hard to overstate that reality. And out of curiosity, or I went back and I looked at some of the election arguments and debates in 2000 before 9/11, right before the election of George Bush. And Condi Rice actually has an article in Foreign Affairs where she argues that the US needs to prioritize its foreign policy much more sharply, and lays out the objectives that the Bush administration really came into office with before 9/11. And those have to do with military competitiveness, but really kind of advancing America's economic reach, extending America's economic influence. And then thirdly, very notably, she talks about the importance of focusing America's political and foreign capital on relationships with what she calls big powers, Russia and China in particular. So it's not just an afterthought to say that in the absence of 9/11, America might have paid more attention to China. I think that really was the intention at the time. But instead, we saw the last 20 years, America really absorbed. There's so many ways we could look at it, but I tend to think, about four things that absorbed a lot of America's energy over the last 20 years. The first being Afghanistan, the second being Iraq, the third being a fundamental reorganization of our military intelligence and law enforcement capacity abroad and at home. We had the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and huge law enforcement and intelligence apparatus to go alongside that. And it spurred a similar type thing in our private sector, which often responds to the public sector. And then lastly, of course, was the CT cooperation that became a focal point of our bilateral relationships around the world. And that was a huge emphasis. So for all we can lament about where America spent the last 20 years in terms of costs and lives and resources and in reputation, I think that it is important to note that the last 20 years haven't, at least from the perspective of the United States, been an age of terror. We did not end up having years punctuated by major terrorist attacks, which was some of the fear and even expectation of experts at the time. The last point I'll make, and I'll make it very briefly because I'm sure we'll return to this, is just, now is really a moment for us to focus sharply on what are the lessons that we take away, particularly from Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's a little difficult to do with the freshness of Afghanistan, but I think from the perspective of an American, there's certainly a lot in our political debate which leads one to be nervous about whether or not we're taking away the right lessons. And I'll just mention three areas that we can delve into if people would like. But I think we're definitely, taking the wrong lessons away about democracy building, taking questionable lessons away about the role of democracy promotion in our foreign policy. And then lastly, I think we're overlearning the lesson of the importance of diplomacy and how it was squeezed out by militarization of our foreign policy to the point where we might have unrealistic expectations about what diplomacy on its own can achieve.